Somewhere in the last 100 years, someone decided that mourning should take about a year. Then the therapists revised it down to 6 months. Then the insurance companies who pay for grief counseling trimmed it further. The DSM, the manual American psychiatrists use to classify mental disorders, now specifies that if you are still significantly impaired by the loss of a loved one after 12 months, you may be diagnosed with a condition called prolonged grief disorder. There is a name in the official literature of mental health for grieving too long. We are the first civilization in human history to have invented it. Every culture that came before us, without exception, across every continent, every era, every religion built elaborate, extended, communal systems for processing loss. Systems that lasted years, that involved the entire community, not just the family, that treated grief not as a private medical event to be managed and resolved, but as a fundamental rupture in the social fabric that required collective repair. We replaced all of that with 5 stages and a timeline. And we have been quietly breaking under the weight of that replacement ever since. To understand what we dismantled, you have to understand what grief actually is, not psychologically, but socially. Human beings are, by evolutionary design, one of the most socially dependent species on Earth. We are born helpless. We survive through attachment. Every significant relationship we form physically reshapes the brain, the neural pathways that anticipate a person's presence, their voice, their behavior become structural features of how we process the world. When that person disappears, the brain doesn't just feel sad, it experiences something closer to a navigational failure. The map still has the territory marked. The territory is gone. This is not metaphor. Neuroscientists studying grief have found that the same brain regions that process physical pain activate during acute grief. The body registers significant loss as injury because for a social animal, it is. Being separated from a deeply attached person triggers the same threat response systems as being separated from shelter in a storm. What this means is that grief, at its biological core, is not a private experience that happens to have social dimensions. It is a social crisis that requires social response. The appropriate treatment for a navigational failure is not to sit alone in a room and process. It is to be surrounded by people who help you rebuild the map. Every pre-modern culture understood this intuitively. None of them needed a neuroscientist to explain it. In ancient Rome, professional mourners were hired to walk in funeral processions, women called praefeci, whose job was to wail loudly, tear their hair, beat their chests, and model grief publicly for the community watching. This was not theater, it was a social technology. The public expression of loss gave the community permission to grieve together, created a shared emotional event that distributed the weight of loss across many people instead of concentrating it in one family, and signaled to the watching world that something significant had happened and the normal rules were suspended. In Victorian England, mourning was an elaborate, years-long social system with precise rules. Widows wore black for 2 years minimum. The first year was full mourning, no social engagements, no jewelry, specific black fabrics with no sheen. The second year was half mourning, grey and purple permitted, limited social reintroduction. But they did something that our system doesn't do. They told the grieving person and told everyone around them exactly where they were in the process. The widow in full mourning didn't have to explain herself at every social encounter. The clothes did it for her. The community knew not to expect her to be fine. The system made space. In Ireland, the tradition of the wake, keeping the body at home, sitting with it through the night, telling stories about the dead, drinking, crying, laughing, was not superstition. It was a structured communal processing of loss that kept the dead present long enough for the living to adjust to their absence. You did not go from presence to gone in the clinical 48-hour hospital to funeral home timeline. There was a transition. The community held it together. In West Africa, among the Akan people, funeral celebrations can last days, involve hundreds of people, and are characterized by music, dancing, and elaborate ceremony that outsiders sometimes mistake for festivity rather than grief. They are both. The Akan understanding is that the dead deserve to be sent off with as much communal energy as they received in life, and that the community needs the collective experience of expressing loss together before it can return to ordinary functioning. Across all of these traditions, across cultures that never contacted each other, the same structure appears. Grief is public, grief is extended, grief is communal, and the community absorbs some of the weight so the bereaved don't carry it alone. What changed was, again, not one thing. It was a sequence of things that each seemed like progress. The medicalization of death moved dying out of the home and into hospitals. Before the 20th century, people died where they lived, in their beds, surrounded by family, with death as a visible, present event that the whole household witnessed and participated in. When dying moved to hospitals and care facilities, death became something that happened elsewhere, behind closed doors, managed by professionals. The community's relationship with death became remote. The rise of the nuclear family as the primary social unit concentrated grief inside smaller and smaller circles. In a village or an extended family network, the death of a parent was a community event. Dozens of people who knew the deceased, who had their own grief to process, who could share the labor of mourning. In a nuclear family, in a suburban house where nobody knows their neighbors, the same death is a private family matter. The circle of shared loss shrank. The weight per person increased. The professionalization of grief, the emergence of grief counseling, grief therapy, grief support groups as organized professional services, solved a real problem created by the collapse of communal mourning. When communities stopped absorbing grief collectively, individuals needed somewhere to put it. But professionalization also completed the privatization. Grief became something you processed in a clinical office with a trained specialist rather than something your community held with you in your living room. And the DSM formalized the endpoint. When grief becomes a diagnosable disorder, if it persists too long, the implicit message is clear. Grief is a malfunction. It has a correct duration. Exceeding it is a medical problem requiring intervention. For 10,000 years, humans were told by their culture, grief is appropriate, grief takes time, the community will be here for as long as it takes. Now they are told, in the architecture of their professional and social world, grief is inconvenient, grief has a deadline, there are specialists for this, and you should be returning to normal function within the year. The results are exactly what you would expect. Complicated grief, unresolved loss that festers and resurfaces years later is now one of the most common presenting conditions in therapy. Researchers studying grief outcomes consistently find that the quality of social support in the immediate aftermath of loss is the single strongest predictor of long-term adjustment. Not the quality of the therapy, not the medication, the community. People who grieve inside functioning communal structures, religious communities, tight-knit ethnic communities, cultures that still practice extended public mourning, show measurably better outcomes than people who grieve in the privatized modern mode. Not because their loss is smaller, because they don't carry it alone. We built a system that isolated grief precisely at the moment when connection is what the broken brain most requires. Here's what's strange. We haven't stopped needing communal grief, we've just stopped having infrastructure for it. The outpourings of public mourning that follow the deaths of public figures, the flowers outside Buckingham Palace when Diana died, the lines around the block to view a lying-in state, the internet memorials that accumulate after any widely felt loss, are not pathological. They are population trying, in the absence of established communal grief rituals, to do the thing that human biology has always required, to grieve together, to make the loss real through collective witness. The hunger was never extinguished, we just closed all the places it used to go. Tonight somewhere, a person is alone in their apartment, 6 weeks after losing someone they loved, pretending to be fine at work, fielding texts that say, thinking of you, from people who don't know how to sit with them, quietly wondering why they still feel as wrecked as the day it happened. They are not malfunctioning. They are the product of a civilization that took a biological, social crisis, one that every human culture in history treated as a community emergency, and told them it was their own private thing to manage on a schedule. The grief isn't the problem.